The security guards at Muhammad Ali's Miami training camp had seen their share of unusual visitors over the years, but nothing had prepared them for what walked through their gates on that humid August morning in 1978. Marcus Johnson, 22 years old with eyes burning with 7 years of accumulated rage, wasn't there for autographs or photos. He was there for justice. Marcus had driven 18 hours straight from Detroit, fury and determination keeping him awake. In the passenger seat lay a yellowed newspaper clipping from November 15th, 1971. Ali destroys Tommy Johnson in round 8. Local fighter's career ends in devastating fashion. Tommy Johnson, Detroit's rising heavyweight hope, had stepped into the ring at Cobo Arena, believing he could defeat Muhammad Ali. He'd fought with the heart of a lion for 7 rounds, actually stunning Ali with a left hook in the fourth. But after round 8, when the referee stopped the fight, Tommy's dreams lay scattered across the canvas like broken glass. Marcus remembered that night with crystalline clarity. The confident man who'd taught Marcus to throw his first punch had been replaced by someone who jumped at loud noises. The fighter who'd once believed he could conquer the world now struggled to get out of bed most mornings. Tommy had started drinking within months. By 1973, he'd lost his job at the Ford plant. By 1975, Marcus's mother had moved out. Marcus had watched his family disintegrate piece by piece, all because Muhammad Ali needed another impressive victory to add to his legendary resume. Now, 7 years later, Marcus stood outside Ali's training facility with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the weight of everything he'd come to say. He'd tried everything else. He'd tried therapy, tried anger management, tried forgetting. But every time he saw Ali's face on television, every time he heard another story about the great champion's wisdom and compassion, the rage would return fresh and hot as the day his father lost everything. The camp was buzzing with activity when Marcus pushed through the entrance. Ali was in the center, holding mitts for a young heavyweight. Even at 36, he moved with the fluid grace that had made him famous, his voice carrying across the gym as he offered encouragement. "That's it, young blood. Keep those hands up. Float like a butterfly, remember?" Marcus stood in the doorway, watching the man who'd haunted his family's nightmares. The contrast between Ali's obvious joy and the destruction he'd left in the Johnson family's wake made Marcus's stomach turn with disgust. Several people noticed the young stranger standing motionless by the entrance, his fists clenched and his jaw set in a way that suggested trouble. Ali's head trainer, Angelo Dundee, started walking toward Marcus with the wary expression of a man who'd learned to recognize potential problems before they escalated. But Marcus was done waiting, done being polite, done allowing Muhammad Ali to live in blissful ignorance of the lives he'd destroyed. Before Dundee could reach him, Marcus's voice cut through the noise of the gym like a blade through silk. "Muhammad Ali!" The entire gym fell silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heavy bags swayed unattended, and every eye in the building turned toward the angry young man whose voice carried the weight of years of accumulated pain. Ali looked up from the mitts he'd been holding, his expression curious rather than concerned. He'd been challenged, threatened, and confronted thousands of times over his career. This felt different, though. There was something in the young man's voice that suggested this wasn't about politics or religion or anything else that typically brought angry visitors to his door. "You destroyed my family," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the rage coursing through his veins. "7 years ago, you stepped into the ring with my father, Tommy Johnson, and you didn't just beat him, you broke him. You took everything he was and everything he dreamed of being, and you shattered it into pieces." The gym remained frozen in uncomfortable silence as Marcus took several steps closer to where Ali stood. Several trainers moved instinctively to intercede, but Ali raised his hand slightly, signaling them to stay back. "My father was a good man before he met you," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He worked 2 jobs to support our family. He coached kids at the local gym for free. He believed in things. He had dignity and pride and hope. And you took all of that away from him in 8 rounds. Ali set down the training mitts and gave Marcus his full attention, his famous smile nowhere to be seen. Instead, his expression was serious, focused, as if he was studying Marcus with the same intensity he'd once reserved for studying opponents before important fights. "After you beat him, he started drinking," Marcus said, tears of anger forming in his eyes, but his voice never wavering. Lost his job, lost his wife, lost his self-respect. You know what he does now, Muhammad Ali? He sits in a bar on Corktown talking about the night he fought the great champion, telling anyone who'll buy him a drink about the one time he almost had you hurt. The truth of what Marcus was saying hung heavy in the air. Everyone in the gym knew the stories of fighters who'd stepped into the ring with Ali and emerged damaged, not just physically, but psychologically. It was the dark side of boxing that people preferred not to discuss, the human cost of creating a legend. You've got fame and money and everyone calling you the greatest, Marcus said, now close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in Ali's dark eyes. But my father has nothing, less than nothing, and it's all because you needed another victory to add to your collection. Several of Ali's handlers were now visibly nervous, unsure how to handle this unprecedented situation. Angelo Dundee stepped forward cautiously, his voice diplomatic but firm. Son, I think maybe you should... No, Ali said quietly, his gaze never leaving Marcus's face. Let him finish. I want to hear what he's got to say. Marcus was surprised by Ali's calm response, having expected defensiveness or dismissal. Instead, the champion seemed genuinely interested in hearing him out, which somehow made Marcus even angrier. How dare Ali be reasonable when Marcus had come here for a fight? I don't want your sympathy, Marcus snapped. I don't want your famous wisdom or your clever words. I want you to know that your success cost my family everything. I want you to know that somewhere in Detroit right now, there's a broken man drinking himself to death because Muhammad Ali needed to prove he was the greatest. The gym remained silent except for the soft whir of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Ali stood perfectly still, absorbing every word Marcus spoke like a fighter absorbing punches, taking the hits without flinching or backing away. Every time I see your face on TV, every time I hear another story about how wonderful and wise you are, I think about my father, Marcus continued. I think about how he used to laugh before he met you, how he used to tell stories and play catch with me and make my mother smile. And I hate you for taking that away from us. The raw honesty of Marcus's pain seemed to affect everyone in the room differently. Some of the younger fighters looked uncomfortable, perhaps thinking about their own fathers or their own dreams of glory. The trainers watched Ali carefully, waiting to see how their champion would respond to such a direct and personal attack. Ali, for his part, seemed to be processing something deeper than just Marcus's words. His eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if he was remembering something from long ago, some conversation or moment that Marcus's story had awakened in his memory. What's your name, young blood? Ali asked softly. The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even a physical confrontation. He hadn't expected this gentle inquiry that somehow made him feel seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and oddly relieving. Marcus Johnson, he replied, his voice losing some of its edge despite his best efforts to maintain his anger. Marcus Johnson, Ali repeated, as if testing how the name sounded. And your father is Tommy Johnson, Tommy from Detroit, the left-handed heavyweight with the green and gold trunks. Marcus's eyes widened in surprise. He'd assumed that his father would be just another forgotten opponent in Ali's long career, one of dozens of men who'd provided stepping stones on the path to greatness. You remember him? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course I remember Tommy, Ali said, his tone carrying a warmth that seemed to come from someplace deep and genuine. November 15th, 1971, at Cobo Arena. Your father was one of the toughest men I ever fought. He dropped me in the fourth round with a left hook that I didn't see coming, made my knees wobble like a newborn colt. The gym was so quiet that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat as Ali continued speaking, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence that had made him famous as a speaker as well as a fighter. That night, your father fought like a man possessed. He wasn't just fighting Muhammad Ali. He was fighting for something bigger than himself. I could see it in his eyes every time we clinched. He was fighting for Detroit, for his family, for every dream he'd ever had. That kind of fighting takes more courage than most men ever have. Marcus felt his carefully constructed wall of anger beginning to crack. This wasn't how this confrontation was supposed to go. Ali was supposed to be dismissive, arrogant, uncaring. He wasn't supposed to speak about Tommy Johnson with respect and genuine admiration. Then why did you destroy him? Marcus asked, his voice now carrying more confusion than rage. If you respected him so much, why didn't you ease up when you had him hurt? Why did you have to break him completely? Ali was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of years of contemplation about the nature of his sport and the responsibilities that came with his gifts. Marcus, let me tell you something about your father that you might not know, Ali said, taking a step closer but maintaining a respectful distance. The night we fought, he came to my dressing room after the fight was over. This was maybe 2 hours later, after the doctors had checked him out and cleared him to leave the hospital. Marcus's forehead creased in confusion. His father had never mentioned visiting Ali after the fight, had barely spoken about that night at all, except when the alcohol loosened his tongue enough to let the pain slip out. Tommy knocked on my door, and when I opened it, he was standing there with a black eye, and his left hand wrapped in ice, Ali continued. You know what he said to me? He said, Champ, thank you for not holding back. Thank you for showing me what greatness looks like. He said fighting me at my best was an honor, even though it ended his career. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He tried to process this version of his father that he'd never heard about, this man who'd found honor in defeat and dignity in destruction. That's impossible, Marcus said, shaking his head. My father hates you. He spent 7 years drowning his shame in bottles because of what you did to him. Ali's expression grew sad, not for himself, but for the pain he could see in Marcus's eyes and the pain he remembered seeing in Tommy's eyes all those years ago. Son, your father doesn't hate me because I beat him, Ali said gently. He hates himself because he couldn't live up to the moment. He had his shot at greatness, came closer than most men ever will, and when it was over, he didn't know how to find meaning in anything smaller than that dream. The truth of Ali's words resonated with Marcus in a way that made his chest ache. How many nights had he watched his father stare at the television, not really seeing whatever was on the screen, but lost in memories of what might have been? But that's not your father's real problem, Marcus, Ali continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man who'd learned hard lessons about fame and failure and the weight of dreams deferred. His real problem is that he's forgotten who he was before he ever stepped foot in a boxing ring. Ali gestured toward the fighters working out around them, young men pursuing their own dreams with the same hunger and determination that had once driven Tommy Johnson. Look around this gym, young blood. Every fighter here is going to lose someday. Most will lose more than they win. That's boxing. That's life. But the ones who survive are the ones who remember that their worth isn't determined by their wins and losses. Marcus wanted to argue, but Ali's words stirred something that felt like recognition. Your father was a good man before he fought me, Ali said firmly. Fighting me didn't change that. Losing to me didn't erase that. But he started believing his value was tied to his success as a fighter. When I was young, I thought boxing was about proving you were better than the other man, Ali continued. I thought winning meant you were stronger, faster, smarter, more worthy. It took me years to understand that boxing is really about testing yourself against your own limitations. Your father tested himself against the best fighter in the world and found his limitations. That doesn't make him a failure. That makes him brave. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes, and he wiped them away angrily with the back of his hand. He'd come here for a confrontation, for some kind of satisfaction, for the chance to make Muhammad Ali understand the pain he'd caused. Instead, he was beginning to understand things about his father that he'd never considered before. Then why is he so broken? Marcus asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Why can't he see what you're saying? Why does he drink himself unconscious every night instead of remembering that he was brave? Ali's expression grew even more gentle, and he reached out slowly, giving Marcus plenty of time to pull away, and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. Because sometimes when we lose something important to us, we focus so much on what we've lost that we forget what we still have, Ali said. Your father lost his dream of being champion, but he still has a son who drove 18 hours to defend his honor. He still has a family that loves him. He still has hands that know how to work and a heart that knows how to care. The simple touch of Ali's hand on his shoulder seemed to break something loose in Marcus's chest. All the anger he'd carried, all the resentment and rage that had fueled his journey to Miami, suddenly felt less important than the aching sadness underneath it all. "I just want my father back," Marcus whispered, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I want the man who used to laugh and tell jokes and make everything seem possible. I want the father I had before you took him away." "I didn't take him away, son," Allie said softly. "He's still there. He's just lost under all that pain and disappointment and shame. But he's still there, waiting for someone to remind him who he really is." Marcus looked up at Allie through tears he couldn't hold back anymore, seeing for the first time not the monster who destroyed his family, but a man who understood something about carrying burdens and finding ways to heal from wounds that couldn't be seen. "How do I do that?" Marcus asked. "How do I help him remember?" Allie was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd spent years learning how to transform pain into purpose. "You go home to Detroit," Allie said, "and you tell your father that Muhammad Ali said he was one of the bravest men he ever fought. You tell him that losing to the best doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. And you tell him that his son loves him enough to drive across the country to defend his honor." Marcus nodded, understanding for the first time that the healing his family needed wouldn't come from confronting Ali or seeking some kind of revenge. It would come from finding a way to help his father remember who he'd been before boxing ever entered his life. "But most importantly," Ali continued, "you tell him that Muhammad Ali remembers Tommy Johnson not as a man who lost a fight, but as a man who had the courage to step into the ring with a dream. That takes something special, Marcus. That takes heart." As Marcus stood in that Miami gym, surrounded by the sounds and smells of boxing, but feeling further from violence than he had in years, he realized that his understanding of strength and courage had been completely transformed. He'd come to Miami looking for a fight and found instead a path toward healing. 3 months later, Marcus sat across from his father in a small diner in downtown Detroit, watching Tommy pick at a plate of eggs that he'd barely touched. It had taken weeks of patient conversation, of slowly sharing what Allie had told him, before Tommy had agreed to meet for breakfast instead of starting his day at Murphy's bar. Tommy looked older than his 48 years, his face lined with the kind of deep fatigue that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from carrying emotional weight for too long. His hands, once quick and powerful enough to stagger Muhammad Ali, now trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. "You really drove all the way to Miami just to yell at Ali?" Tommy asked, a ghost of his old smile flickering across his weathered features. "I was going to do a lot more than yell," Marcus admitted. "I thought maybe if I could make him understand what he'd done to you, to us, it would somehow make things better." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, staring out the diner's window at the Detroit street where he'd grown up, where he'd first learned to fight, where he'd once believed anything was possible. "And what did the champion tell you?" Tommy asked, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Marcus repeated Allie's words carefully, exactly as he'd heard them in that Miami gym. He talked about courage and dignity and the difference between losing a fight and losing yourself. He watched his father's face as he spoke, seeing emotions flicker across Tommy's features like shadows from passing clouds. When Marcus finished, Tommy was crying silently, tears streaming down his cheeks as he stared at the untouched food on his plate. "He said that?" Tommy whispered. "He actually remembered me?" "He remembered everything, Dad. The green and gold trunks Mom made for you. The left hook that dropped him in the 4th round. The way you fought that night like a man possessed. He called you one of the bravest men he ever faced." Tommy wiped his eyes with a paper napkin, his hands steadier than they'd been in months. "I went to see him after the fight," Tommy said quietly. "I never told anyone that, not even your mother. But I needed to shake his hand, needed to thank him for not holding back. I knew my career was over the moment I woke up in that hospital, but I also knew I'd been in the ring with greatness." Marcus felt his own eyes filling with tears as he listened to his father speak with more clarity and strength than he'd heard in years. "Then what happened?" Marcus asked. "Why did you forget that feeling? Why did you let the losing become bigger than the fighting?" Tommy was quiet for a long time, considering the question that had probably haunted him for 7 years without his ever being able to articulate it. "Because when you touch greatness, even for a moment, everything else feels small afterward," Tommy said finally. I came so close to something magnificent that ordinary life felt like failure in comparison. I lost sight of the fact that just getting that close was extraordinary in itself. Over the following months, something remarkable began to happen in the Johnson family. Tommy started coming to breakfast instead of starting his days with whiskey. He began talking about his boxing career not as a failure, but as an adventure that had taken him places most people never go. He started working again, first part-time at a local gym, then full-time as a trainer for young fighters who needed guidance from someone who understood both the dreams and the realities of professional boxing. The change wasn't instant or complete. There were still bad days, still moments when the old pain would surface and threaten to pull Tommy back into the darkness he'd inhabited for so many years. But now he had tools to fight back, perspectives that helped him remember who he was beyond his losses and defeats. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself drawn to boxing for the first time in his life. Not as a way to live out his father's unfulfilled dreams, but as a way to understand the sport that had shaped his family's story. He began training at the gym where Tommy worked, learning not just how to fight, but how to find meaning in the struggle itself. In 1980, 2 years after Marcus's confrontation with Ali, the champion retired from boxing. Tommy and Marcus watched the press conference together. As Ali spoke about his career, Tommy leaned over and whispered, "You know what I learned from fighting Muhammad Ali? I learned that losing to greatness doesn't diminish you. It elevates you. Not everyone gets that chance." Marcus looked at his father and saw not the broken man from before, but the fighter who'd been brave enough to face impossible odds. The same courage that had carried Tommy into that ring was now carrying him out of darkness. Years later, Marcus became a trainer alongside his father, helping young fighters understand that worth isn't determined by records, but by willingness to face challenges. Their gym became known as a place where fighters learned not just how to win, but how to lose with dignity. The yellowed newspaper clipping still sits framed on their gym wall, surrounded by photos of all the fighters Tommy has trained. Men and women who learned from someone who understood that courage isn't about never falling down, but about getting back up and helping others do the same. Muhammad Ali never knew the full impact of that Miami conversation, but in a small Detroit gym, his wisdom continues shaping fighters who learn that true champions are measured not by victories, but by their ability to transform struggles into strength that lifts others.